In any creative field, a lot of the dialogue is about, like, a lot of the conversation is about, like, creating.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of it. But part of the creating process is to eliminate, right? And editing and removing and trying stuff out and moving on, right? And we don't really talk about that aspect of the creative process. And it just sounds like very interesting. So that's why we're talking about it today.
Because it's hard to come up with the first idea. So therefore there's a lot of focus on that.
And actually I don't know what's most difficult. If it's most difficult to create something, or if it's more difficult to edit something you've created.
Well, what's more difficult for you?
I feel the editing.
Why?
Because you can always come up with ideas, right? But the editing is really like trying to get to the best idea, right? And there's things there's ideas or parts of designs that you kind of get attached or you get interested in, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense for a project. And having to give up on a portion of the design that maybe you would like to pursue just because it doesn't make sense for this project, sometimes it's kind of like, man, I wish I could keep developing that, but no, I have to go back and go in another direction.
I think this is more of a challenge with younger designers and especially students. So like when you don't have a lot of experience, it means that you don't have experience doing the thing, but it also means you haven't done many projects, design projects or have projects be built, either of those two categories. And so I think as a result of that, there's much more an urge to put out all of your ideas, because if you have those ideas, you have them and you want to put them out on paper as much as possible, as fast as possible. For your own self-expression, sometimes there's some ego involved to demonstrate to the professor, to your colleagues, to the industry, to whatever, that you can do this, you have thought of this, like this is my idea, look how interesting this is, and then I'm doing it. But I think that's also why the first handful of projects an architect does, or an architecture student, let's say, there's oftentimes too many ideas, right? Because they're trying to shove all of it in there for understandable reasons, because they're excited, let's say. But you can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's not where I'm at, but yeah. Yeah, no, it is true. It is true. But I mean, also, it's hard when you again get excited about something to kind of like calm down your excitement and focus your excitement.
So how do you know if in the editing process, if something should be cut out?
Well, I feel like you could kind of tell, it just, when something feels like it doesn't really belong to the project, or if you were to remove it and it would not impact the project, then it's kind of like, well, then do we need it? So I think that's kind of how you make that decision.
I mean, I think in the conceptual space of unbuilt work, it's more, I think there is the visual test, kind of like you're describing. When you look at it, it just feels odd. And that's where you would rely on more seasoned professionals and teachers to tell you, like, this thing that you've stuck on, like, what is that about? I feel like the first test is the visual one, which maybe as a student is tough for you to see, especially because you have bias, and also you have tunnel vision when you're working on something for all days and nights, on end. You lose sight of what you're looking at. The other way that I think whether or not a portion of a project is unnecessary or superfluous gets tested is through conversation and dialogue and discourse. Right? So the teacher or students will ask you, like, well, what is this thing? What is it there for? And if you don't have a good articulate reason as to why it should be in the project, it's a pretty good sign it probably doesn't belong in the project.
No.
I mean, I do think there are times, though, where the intuition has a very strong role. And there have been many times when I was a student, and even now, where there's something in the project that I know if you remove it, it doesn't feel right, but I don't have the words to articulate why this thing should be there. And I think that's also valid. And then it takes time during the course of the project or the next week to realize, okay, this was the reason why it doesn't feel right when it's gone. And other times too, especially earlier on in my career, I wouldn't really be able to put words to it until years later. And, the project is done, it's frozen in time, it's in the portfolio, student portfolio. You look back on it, say, yeah, the reason why it made sense because of X, Y, and Z things. I just couldn't say it then. So it is tricky, but in general, of course, if you can't explain it, then something's amiss.
Yeah.
Or if you can't even express like the feelings you're having, through diagrams or through hand gestures, then something's not necessary.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think that's, the editing process, the editing part of the creative process happens in school, like you mentioned. And I think it's hard. It is harder in school to edit your project because, like you said, like you're much more kind of like one with your project.
Yeah.
And again, you are your own client.
Yeah.
So you're the own your own creator and your own client. So you really don't have another side that's asking you to edit or has constraint for you to edit.
True. True.
Once you get into the real world and you start working on project, the editing process keeps happening, but it's dictated by other things than maybe just yourself and you as a creator, right? It could come from, I don't know, let's say the budget of a project is going to edit what materials you can use or how many square feet you can have the project. The client's wish list and feedbacks might also make somewhat of an indirect edit on the design.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to take those feedbacks in and edit the project that way. And it's kind of another set of challenge because you kind of have to understand the constraints and feedback to make the right edits to the project itself.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's not just you looking at it from a creator standpoint and making edits as the maker, right?
Yeah.
Like any craftsman would make edit to the piece that they're crafting. Any artist would do that on their own.
Yeah.
But now you're also, adding to that process feedbacks and other things coming into that loop.
Yeah.
But they're not coming from you. So you have to understand them correctly to make the right edits.
It is often said that architects are good at problem solving and they like constraints, or rather they are good at working with constraints. And constraints become the genesis for something very interesting. Like this has been said many, many times, and it's true. And it's actually very much like what you're saying. The more difficult projects sometimes are the ones where there's not enough constraints and it's just open, endless. You could do whatever you want. I was speaking with some architects recently in a closed conversation, and one of them was saying that they worked in the past for a very high-profile architect, Starchitect. Everyone would know this architect's name. And he joked. He said, when I was in that office, they had all these projects and he was on the worst one because in that worst project, he was sort of joking. It was the worst project because the Starchitect was struggling the most with that one because there were no constraints.
Yeah.
It was a very simple, like open site, simple program, and not a lot of things to push up against or to fight against. And therefore, they just kept spinning their wheels like a hamster in a wheel, just going around and around. Then they couldn't figure out like what to do because there was nothing to respond to. And I think, so first of all, a quick tangent. When you find yourself in that headspace for a real project or a student project, you have to, I wouldn't say invent constraints, but that's where the idea, the thesis, and the concept of the project becomes that through line. It's not a constraint, but it becomes like the rails in a way for the project. And that is what, it's this line going down the center of the process and the design, this conceptual line. And you have to, and everything you do is kind of judged as to how close you are to that line. And things that are in the design like fall directly in this path. It expresses the idea. Some deviate slightly, but it's okay because it's solving other things beyond just the concept. But when you get too far out from that and you have something that's floating in space, it's too far off the path. So I don't think there's ever a project where there are not enough constraints. It's just a matter of being more open to the information that is part of the project, the context, the site, the climate. There's always location involved at a minimum. There's always users involved at a minimum, and there's always an idea involved at a minimum. If we take away schedule and budget and like client preferences, so you still always have these things as quote constraints. I think the thing that you mentioned that's interesting though is like, well, let me go back real quick. So this also reminded me, I was at a critique years ago, and there was a student presenting their work, and it was good work. They were working hard. That wasn't an issue, and they had the skills, but they were just struggling. And one of the critics said, it's because you're making it too hard on yourself. You're trying to solve like everything according to your idea or your ideal, your principles, when you should be looking at other real things. In this case, for your building, like, it's a multifamily housing structure. Like, be more pragmatic about it. Like, use the building code to help you edit and make decisions for you. Like, you're forced to have stairs within certain distances of certain types and whatever. You can't get around that. That can actually become a great tool for you because it'll help you pare down and focus your thinking. But what you said also reminded me that, like, what is the difference? Well, I'll ask you, what is the difference between editing versus value engineering? Because in this conversation, we're talking about editing as this positive thing that an architect should do natively. Value engineering is maybe the other side of the same coin, but it's thought about as a very negative thing that's forced on us. We have to value engineer. It's not ideal.
I mean, they're both kind of doing the same thing. I think the difference is that value engineering often happens further in the design process, and as the name kind of like alludes to, it is based on how much it costs.
Budget cost, yeah.
And that's why things get edited out of a project. So
or VE'd, as we would say.
That's a pretty gross word. So that's kind of it. It's like, how do we simplify and cheapify
cost-effectify
the project.
Yeah.
So it's more of a budgetary efficiency that the edits, that's the reason why those edits are made. But editing in the design process doesn't always have to be related to that. Again, it could be like, well, it doesn't fit the concept. Well, it doesn't make sense with the overall vibe we're going for this project.
Yeah.
Or it could be like, well, actually, this other solution seems to do more. And, that's that. Or editing isn't always removing things. It could also be like refining things, right? I mean, again, I'm thinking of a sculptor. You start with a block, and you're editing, you're making a move, or a painter, like you're adding a bit more paint here, you're like tweaking. It's about tweaking. It's about removing, but it's also about tweaking. It's about,
Yeah. I mean, the clearest analogy is in film or writing. Actually, a lot of other mediums, but like in film, you shoot all of the material, and then it goes to the editing room. And in theory, when you're in the editing room, you don't produce extra material. You have what you have. You have the material, the raw material, and you have to put together the stuff to create a story.
And it's kind of in some way, like if we think about design phases, right? Maybe editing happens after concept design when you start getting into schematics. Or maybe editing happens again when you end schematics and you're getting into design development, right? You're getting a little bit deeper, and like you're really looking at everything more closely. The analogy to film, I think, was the thing I was thinking of when I was, mentioning when you work on real project, and the editing process is not just a one-way editing process. It's like a one-way editing process. It's like a team conversation editing process.
Yeah.
Right? It's the same with film, right? Yeah. The director has an idea of like what the project wants to be, and like everyone else is working toward that idea, right?
I have to say that's one of the more satisfying parts of the architecture design process, is when you're roundtabling it with other consultants and professionals, and you all have a clarity on the goal you're trying to achieve. And you're just, it's pure puzzle problem solving to get there. You test out different stuff. You're like, well, why don't we use this mechanical system? When we do a different system in that zone, or maybe we can reroute it and go through the wall, or we can go through the beam and make a hole that's big enough. I mean, now I'm getting into like really specific examples, but it's like very satisfying work to think about. Well, that's more problem solving, but at some point things need to be kicked out for the sake of efficiency. It's kind of like, I was thinking about the film editing process, and I was stating that you only have a certain amount of material, the raw footage. Yeah. And the same thing could be applied to architecture in terms of many different things. Building materials for sure, but that also basically translates directly to cost or to glazing in the case of like California, where we have Title 24 to be concerned with, or like the schedule. You only have a certain amount of resources, is another way to put it. And you have to use those resources in a way that, makes sense, that all things considered. And that is, I think, a big part of when you expand the idea of editing. I think it gets to that space as well.
Yeah, it does. And what's interesting with the analogy of movies, is that sometimes you shoot an extra scene that just doesn't make it in the movie.
A lot of times.
A lot of times. Like you have a bunch of extra footage that's just
extra
no
footage.
one is ever going to see. And it's kind of the same thing with, architecture. Like to get to the design, like we do so many iteration and we try so many things, and most of those like no one will ever see. They would it's kind of sad. There should be like a cemetery or a repository place for like all of the designs that
would be a good
that were generated during a project design process but never made it to anything more than that.
That would be a really good gallery idea. So anyone
like
who has a gallery wants to like do this, an exhibition, and it would be architects contributing their ideas that get kicked aside. But the rule is, when you submit your materials, you can't edit them and you can't enhance them. It's raw. So if you had a model that you were working on in Rhino, then you just take a screenshot of it. You can't make it a rendering. You can't mess with line weights. You can't change the background of Rhino. You can't do anything. We just want to see exactly what it was in that moment when you decided to kick it out. And for more experienced architects, that means those materials are very rough. Like, it's an interesting thing, and this may be a tangent, but like the more mature you become as an architect, when you look at the more mature you become, the less you need the graphics of your drawings to be at a certain level in order for you to critique it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, we can look at a shitty Rhino or SketchUp model or a crappy hand drawing or a technical drawing that has no line weights and no arc at all, and look at it and say, this is not good for design reasons. And I think that is difficult to do when you're younger. And when there are challenges, that's when you start to maybe this rolls over into the idea of techniques for editing. That's when you have to take that drawing, let's say, and distill it or redraw it in different manners to try and pull out the things that you are seeing subconsciously and bring them to the surface. So then you can say, okay, I've done another sketch with trace on top of that. And by the way, when you do that with a thick felt pen, and in my case, like, you are editing in that moment as you're tracing. Mm-hmm. You're editing because you're adding stuff to the paper, obviously, but you are choosing to leave out probably 90% of the information. So that floor plan that has all these dimensions and room tags and window mullion sizes and stuff like that becomes distilled to 10 different lines. That's a process of like hyper editing. And then it pulls off the page the stuff that's the most important. And then you can look at it with clarity and say, okay, this is, I'm confirmed. I had suspicions and feelings this wasn't right. And now I see very clearly this layer, this diagram. That's why it's not right. The diagram doesn't make sense. And I think it's like this X-ray of reduction. And in terms of techniques for editing and the process, for me, if I'm getting more specific, that's one of the best ones. And I think that's why a lot of partners do it, right? Maybe because they're of a certain generation and they're used to that, but also there is something about that, right? Quick trace paper, magic markers and thick pens, and then boom, it's clear. We know they're right and wrong.
Partners do that too because they don't have the time to get into the rest. So they just give like an overall view and like quick and easy. And here's my doodle. Good luck interpreting.
That was the I remember when we watched the documentary about Louis Kahn. One of his former employees was basically, complaining about how difficult of a boss he was, and he said that he would come in and do these magnificent charcoal drawings and be like, okay, but your charcoal line weight is a 1/4 inch wide. You're hiding a lot of stuff in there to make things work out. Like, how are you going to do this? And it's up to someone else to figure out it according to that person.
And it's kind of interesting actually if you think about that, because if the next person who takes that sketch and push it further was a different person, the building will come out in a completely different way, potentially.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what's fascinating in design, is that when you have it becomes a teamwork. It really could take any shape and form depending on like who's the next person in the team is taking it to the next step.
Yeah, well, that's where I think diagrams are such an important tool for architects, for editing, but also like in general, to think conceptually and all of these things. Because again, you're pulling away all the details that are just all the other stuff that's just like the dressing on the cake. Mm-hmm. Dressing on the cake, the decoration on the cake, the flowers and the chocolate things and the candle, like all but the what?
Oh, it's not dressing. What is it called? Icing.
All the icing.
Put Caesar dressing on your cake.
Yeah, all the icing and all that stuff is being just, you throw that aside and you say, okay, what is the core thing that we're dealing with? And what I like about that is that it's helpful for you as an individual, but also you can take that thing, like you said, pass it to someone else and then see their iteration of it. I think that's their version of it. I think that's really hard to do when you're just passing the full cake. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
Why
I think
are you laughing?
No, I was just thinking about how we work in the office, and it's very much like, yeah, you are the guy with the charcoal, and I have to work on the icing. And in some ways it works, and it doesn't always have that. It
works for me.
People have to just have that role in the team and on projects. But I think it works because it kind of like always looks at the project from like a very bird's eye view or like a very deep into it view. And that's the only way you can, like if you edit in Photoshop a photo, right, you can get to the micro pixel of cleaning things up and making things perfect. But you also have to zoom out and see if you're ever going to notice it.
It's funny. That actually reminds me, in Photoshop, there's this weird phenomenon where when you're editing something, you zoom in really, really close and you think like, okay, I'm going to be very clean about it because this is a big rendering, let's say, and everything needs to be clean because it's going to be printed giant. And you're like, okay, I'm going to make this line perfect. And when you're zoomed in, you edit it like, yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly. And you zoom out, you're like, wait, what the fuck? Why is it crooked? Why is it like a shade yellow? I didn't do that. And I think there is that difference in clarity of being zoomed in and versus zoomed in and zoomed out. And that's one of the great joys of working with other people as opposed to being by yourself as a student. It also makes it a lot easier because, well, there's challenges as well, but easier because you're just passing things back and forth. But
I think that also makes sure you're not doing things with ego too,
With ego, again,
or biases that you're trying to like plug into every single design and force into projects.
Yeah, and that happens all the time. Not in the end, but in the process. I mean, for all architects, you're doing something, you're like, wow, that's really cool shit. Let's do it. And then, someone else or yourself will say, yeah, but why am I doing that? Is it because I've always like secretly loved brutalist architecture and concrete, and therefore I want to do that thing just because I happen to be biased and I'm inherently, for whatever reason, drawn toward this thing? Or am I doing it because it actually makes sense for the project in addition to the cool factor?
And it's kind of a hard question to answer because I feel like you should be drawn to certain things in order for your sensibility as a designer to be yours and to be unique. It's like whatever flavors and colors make you, right? So it's kind of like, the being biased and having interest and liking one aesthetic versus the other is oftentimes like not well perceived because it feels like it's forced onto design. But in the same times, I feel like it has to be there. Otherwise, like AI could just design things and everyone would just design the same stuff, right?
I think too, this bleeds over into the reality that the correct pairing of architect and client has to do with shared aesthetic visions and sensibilities, and that's just what it is. I've said it before, but like a lot of architects like to claim that they are unbiased and more objective, because we do have to be very rational people, and we do have to justify even our creative ideas to ourselves, to our colleagues, to clients, to the board, to the audience. We have to justify everything we do to everybody. And I think because of that, we like this idea that every time we approach a project, it's with like fresh eyes, and every project is different, and that's what we do. And there's truth to that, but you're the same person from project to project.
Yeah.
So that's also fundamentally not true. And I think just, as I've said before, balancing that threshold or those two sides, let's say, and toggling back and forth to find the right mixture of the two is a quest that all architects should consciously think about. Otherwise, I don't think it's honest to say otherwise. I think it's not true.
I agree. I mean, and you learn from the project you've done before, the one you're currently working on, and this influence how you're going to look at this current project. So you can't go past that. But I think it's not about starting fresh every time. It's about being open-minded every time, despite all of the luggage of design that you're carrying with you, right? Like maybe you might look at it the way you would typically look at it, and then you're going to question it, and maybe you're going to go in a different direction and explore something else. I think it's just being open-minded to trying out different things,
What's weird is that as an architect, the more experience you gain, obviously the more things you see. Your own work, all of the many iterations that didn't happen, which I do want to talk about. Reference projects, architecture you see on vacations, or just buildings that aren't architecture. And I feel like it's very important to, so you have that catalog to some degree, right? I feel like it's very important to never fully close a door on anything you see, even if you hate it. So I know obviously we talk in here, we have our preferences for this and that and whatever, but I think it's very important to keep that door like always cracked open. But I also find, and now this is a tangent, I don't want to get into this, but I also find that the way that mentality is communicated also has a direct role in the success of marketing oneself to people. So if you speak in a manner where you're like, well, there's a possibility, that makes you less desirable because it sounds like you're uncertain. Compared to someone's like, the door's shut, that's horrible design, we will never do that, blah. And then for the audience who doesn't know anything, like that person's ultra confident, let's use that person. Meanwhile, that person's full of bullshit. That's a tangent. But going back to the idea of value engineering though, it made me think that, one of the differences in the outcomes of value engineering as it is often done versus editing in the design process is that value engineering oftentimes weakens the architecture. It shouldn't if it's done correctly, but oftentimes it weakens the architecture because it was not planned for. I mean, it's never really planned for, but it wasn't like planned for enough. You know what I mean?
Or I think when it does that to the architecture, it's because it's probably happening way too late.
Too late.
It's probably happening way too late, and it's at the point where the cut needs to be so big to make a dent that it's really gonna not have the project. Rather than like trying to do it like as you're designing, so you don't feel like anything has been taken out.
I think it's the difference in the type of reduction or the impact that reduction has. Are you removing from a chunk of marble to create the statue of David? Or are you removing, chunks from a piece of cheese? Now it's Swiss cheese and it has no, I mean, Swiss cheese is quite beautiful, but it has no like integrity to it.
Yeah.
It's just this hollow skeleton shadow of a self versus being what would appear to be in the case of the statue, exactly what it wanted to be, and then some. And I think that's also in one of the interesting things about producing a real building is that for us, we always have to think about the survival of the project, the conceptual project and its essence, the statue, making sure that is the thing that gets realized. And survival means that you have, and every practicing architect knows that the word survival is the correct one because you have it during schematic design. Wow, it's amazing. Rendering, look at that. We got all of the shit we want is in there. The sky is perfect. Everything's perfect. And slowly that it can feel like that gets eroded or can get eroded over time because of all the stuff that gets hit with us, the codes, the schedule, the client pivoting and going around in circles, the budget, the this and the that and the whatever. And so it's critical, it's crucial for us to think about even in that early schematic design rendering, okay, if I have to remove 50% of the project, whatever that means, is it 50% of the materials, is it a budget, is it a glazing, whatever, is it going to still be as honest as that statue in the end? That's you have to ask that question, and you have to plan for it. If you don't plan for that, then you are destined for failure. Because all that shitstorm of stuff that I mentioned that wants to eat away at the project, I guarantee you that will happen. There's never been a project in the history of architecture and modern age where that has not happened.
And you know, that goes back to another topic we've talked about many times, is doing pre-construction services with contractors throughout the design process, because that's the only way you can avoid being in that situation where the statue of David is missing its head.
His head. Oh my God.
No, but you know what I mean? Like you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
You don't want to lob off a major chunk
carved
of
it
a
from
project.
the feet up to get to the neck. So a client comes in. So by the way,
We don't have enough money
economy's
left.
not doing so good right now. So we're going to stop right here.
No roof.
You know, but it's true. And so it reminds us, like a specific example, we had a project where there was a lot of glass. And the glass was there almost like just as a way to enclose space. So it was invisible. And it was big big sliding, pocketing doors, floor to ceiling, indoor, outdoor, that whole thing. So that means when it's open, it's just, the house is almost like a pavilion. And when it's closed, it still has a pavilion nature, but obviously you're protected from the weather. Now, there are window companies that have ultra sleek profiles that are perfect for that. And those are very expensive. There are window companies that are fairly sleek. I would still say very, very, very slim.
Yeah.
Not quite as slim, but very slim, much more cost effective. That's okay. There are companies where the mullion gets fatter or the frame gets fatter and they're cheaper. And my point is, at some point, the more cost effective windows, the fatter those mullions become. And one could say, well, across the entire budget for the project, if we just look locally at the windows, and we're trying to reduce from there, we can go all the way down to a different window manufacturer where you have 6-inch, mullions, next to each other, frames next to each other. With the concept behind that project, that would be a travesty. It doesn't work. At some point, when those window frames get too thick, the idea and the essence, the sculpture of the project disintegrates.
Yeah.
So in that case, it was like, okay, well, maybe the glazing system in these certain areas, we pare it down to a more cost-effective solution, but we hold our minimum width, or maximum width, I should say. Other windows that are less important, let's use a different company for those, and let's see if we can bring down the total project budget and editing in other places so we can make sure to preserve the window system that we need.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't know, that's more of a professional thing, but like that's an example of value engineering, but doing it in a more sophisticated manner and holistic view, rather than simply saying windows are too expensive, find me a window system that's a third of the price, and we're going to put that in there. I don't really care about, it's not really about the window system. It's not really about the Corten. It's not really about the wood. It's not really about the whatever. It's about the entire thing and having the ability to edit in the key places so you are not distracting from, again, this sculpture. And I feel like we do this as an office. I feel like not all architects do, and it's like, well, that's where you can't not get into the nitty-gritty of construction costs of things. Like at some point you have to in project, because there's going to be all these issues that come up because of the economy or tariffs or whatever else.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and it's a tricky balance to find, and I think that's why I don't really like the word value engineering, because it really just put the focus on the dollar amount, and versus editing is looking at the overall product, like the final thing, and I think it just makes much more sense. I was wondering, what do you think is harder? Is it harder to subtract from a project, from a design, or to add to it? It's tricky, right? Because I feel like depending on how, let's say, minimal the design is, like removing, I just leave it to like, it's just Jeep walls and that's it.
Yeah.
You know, or not, or maybe it's just, you know, one extra thing. But at the same time, adding to something that's fairly clear could create confusion.
I would say adding is more
I
difficult.
think adding is. I think adding is probably more difficult because if it wasn't there to start with, then that probably means that the design didn't necessarily need it.
Right.
Right.
I mean,
it depends, but you know.
Yeah, no, of course it depends. The part that's difficult is when you have a design and you feel like something's missing.
Yeah.
Something just a little bit off. Like, you have a dessert you're eating and it's just like it's missing something, but you don't quite know what. And every time you try to add something, it doesn't feel right. That is very difficult because you're like, well, what the fuck am I supposed to do? There's not, what do I do here? We can't, and that's a tricky one.
It's a tricky one.
That's a tricky one. And I think also...
But it could also just be that it just needs a little something. It doesn't need to be a big gesture.
Yes. But I think that's also where it's helpful to understand that in architecture design, there are primary elements, secondary elements, and tertiary elements. There's really not elements. There's not a fourth layer, really. There's only kind of 3 layers. And actually, that is one of the projects was we had the fundamentals of the house, and it was cooking, and it made sense. But from a sculptural and conceptual standpoint. But we had all this program in the house that needed to be enclosed. And we're like, well, how do we do this? Because what we have is so pure and distilled. But it doesn't work functionally because we're not enclosing spaces. You can't have a house that's just like open to the outside. And so in that case, every time we added something, it just didn't feel right. It felt forced because now we had the purity of the primary elements. And these other things we're sticking in, we're like competing with the primary elements. Yeah. So then we developed the clarity of like, okay, let's figure out a thing to add that is not of the same, in this case, material or being as the primary elements. It's a new element. It's a secondary one. And there's a conceptual reasoning as to why there would be this secondary element in this project. And once we had that it was not easy, but that kind of unlocked the path because it was like, okay, now we have the freedom to add these other things to do what we need to do and to enhance the architecture to make it real without distracting from the primary elements that we originally had, which were exactly what they needed to be. They didn't need to be anything more. They didn't need to be less. They didn't need to be morphed around. They were fine. And So I think thinking about it in terms of layers, the primary, secondary, and tertiary is a very helpful way to understand it. And there's also some truth too. I think that some of the architecture I'm most drawn toward is because it engages all 3 layers. Mm-hmm. Like there's definitely some architecture like Mies van der Rohe architecture, like the Farnsworth House, where there's like a primary and then not even a secondary, like a 1.5, layer, and that's it. And I get it, and it's beautiful. But I tend to naturally appreciate the architecture that has all 3.
A few more layers.
And the third layer is there, and it's a decoration. It has no structural, no programmatic, no nothing other than just aesthetics. It's like the icing on the cake, but it really solidifies this thing as a true work of architecture. I think that's very impressive, and I think it's a more you don't really. That's something you don't learn how to do until you're further on in your career. Because when you're a student and you're younger, you're just trying to figure out how to produce primary things that look and feel good.
You're just trying to understand how to make the dough of the cake.
Just the fundamentals.
Yeah, there's no fanfetti, there's no,
And actually the students have problems when they start throwing in all this other stuff. And it's like, this is too soon. Like strip out your fountains, all this other stuff you have, like strip that all away, get down to the core, and then we can layer on complexity as we go forward in your career. And I think that's the mark of a more mature architect is when you have those subtle moments that are not part of the big partie diagram, but they are adding to it. That's difficult to learn.
So beautiful listening to you talk. What a poet. What a poet. So do you think that most architects are afraid of editing because it's going to look like the building is doing less? Like, do you feel like architects have a kind of a tendency to want to like over provide with design?
It depends on the architect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
outside the
some
window, probably not.
I think some architects do that, and it's like I see it a lot in more avant-garde architects, like kids from SciArc, and it's like they're driven by an idea that's unrelated to any of the parameters I've described, and it's a conceptual thing, or it's a research project where they're interested in like, you know, the skeleton makeup of birds, and that becomes like the form for architecture. That was done like 20 years ago, but like that is an example. And a lot of the stuff that's kind of goopy looking seems to have the same stems from that time. Anyway, or there's like, you know, a bunch of deconstructed angle stuff, and I feel like a lot of those projects rely on superfluousness to be successful because they just don't care about the idea of editing. Like their objective as an architect is not really so much what I've described. I mean, where there's alignment for sure, but it's more like, again, I have this thesis that I want to put into reality, like Eric Owen Moss and all the stuff in Culver City. You know what I mean? Like he has his, it's more like art at that point. In a certain sense, rather than architecture. And that's a whole other conversation. Yeah, and the agenda is different. Yeah. And therefore, the idea of like editing is sort of there. Of course, there's editing within what they're doing, but in the big picture, it's just kind of like not, I don't know, they've ruled it out by finding the right client to back them or something like that. So I've always felt like if you rely on things that could have been edited out to produce good architecture, that means that you don't have the skill set of architects who can do that. I think it's difficult to edit and have something be beautiful and correct in the end. It's easy to stick stuff on. Actually, let me rephrase. I'll say it's easier to stick a bunch of stuff on and do a bunch of wacky things or not wacky things and have it look cool. That's actually maybe, you know, going back to the idea of the agenda. Like when you're editing is a lot of times thought about as the quest for purity, an expression of purity at a minimum. When you add stuff on, I find as somewhat forced. It's because you're just after the cool factor, and it's a completely set of criteria therefore in the architect's mind. So I forget what the question was, but I think some architects avoid editing because they don't know how, or they don't care, and they reject it. And I think that's honestly it's a very arrogant and a non what am I saying? A non-citizen's perspective to like reject this idea. Like, no, we must have this, we must have that. We must have all of the gizmos and gadgets and all the cool stuff in here for it to work. And it's kind of like, well, you're not really actually addressing the problem. You're dismissing the problem. And then you're claiming that your stuff is awesome. And I find that to be...
But I think you can see that in some projects you see, you know, published or photographed. Like you could see that it's kind of a hodgepodge of stuff.
True.
And I'm like, did you look at your project?
Yeah.
Did you bother thinking like, does this belong with that? And did we need 15 different moves in this space? Yeah. And
this happens on the interiors as well.
That happens a lot on the interiors, and you know, interior design is a whole other thing. Interior designers have a brain that works very differently from architects, I feel like, too. So I don't know what the editing process is from like a decorator, you know, a perspective, but I feel like it's very agenda based.
It's very agenda based, and I guess that's what I'm saying too. Part of my critique is like, for those architects and designers that operate with those projects. Those projects have a certain budget.
Yeah.
And that allows them to do all this stuff. Or in the case of like decorating, like just throw everything in there. And it's good because I say it's good and that's what I do. And if you can't afford it, then I'm not going to work with you. And I just think that that is not the mark of an actual expert at the craft of interior design or architecture. That's the mark of someone who's found wealthy people and has not had to deal with the true question. And earlier I said, all practicing designers and architects find their right clients, and that's true. But I really don't agree, almost morally, with this idea that to produce good architecture, in my view, it requires $2,000 a square foot for someone to spend. Like that, there's something fundamentally wrong and flawed about the profession and about that individual's perspective if they demand to have all these add-on things in order for it to be successful in their eyes. To me, you lack skills. That's what I think. You lack skill set, and you lack compassion also for people who are on a budget, or even wealthy people who are on a budget. So I
think it
don't
also
agree with
goes
that.
back in the ability to make choices and decisions and cutting stuff out and keeping stuff in. Like, you see how many mansions and villas and houses in LA, for example, that are very expensive and they're absolutely atrocious.
Yeah.
Because it's just like everything you could think of is there. There is no editing.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no editing. And the result is not good,
That is a good point. A lot of the things that are published in things like in publications like Art Digest, no, they're so bloated. They could use half of the stuff that's in there, and that's where I think it's irresponsible, because it's a waste of resources.
Yeah.
Even if the person has money, it's a waste of money. That money could be spent for something else. It's a waste of materials. It's a waste of labor, because you've produced this Frankenstein monstrosity that's gold plated and has 15 different materials in every room just because you can. That is a grotesque use of human resources across the board, considering where we are, in the broader scope of things. And so I think another question for me that I was wondering is, when you're starting the design, some materials. You talked about when you only have gyp or drywall or stucco on the outside. I think it's a good exercise, right? Can you create a beautiful house or building where the materials are bare minimum?
Yeah.
You don't have any materials.
Yeah.
You only have those two things that I mentioned, and paint. Let's say there's no paint even. It's just white, right? And I think that a lot of especially in LA, the luxury people, they could never do that. Right? It's like, you need to go back to architecture school or design school, which you probably didn't do.
And it's kind of a cop-out too.
Go to second year and create a pavilion that looks good with a few pieces of paper. If you can't do that, then you don't deserve to have these budgets. No, but really.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
I mean, I find that also starting simple is sometimes... Well, let me ask, to put on you, do you prefer to start simple or start complex? Start simple and then make it complex, or start complex and then reduce?
I'm trying to think of projects to understand where I usually stand on this question. I would say I probably have a tendency of trying to start simple and add complexity. Just to have more of a clarity of the bigger gesture, and then to have the time to dive more deeply and layer in the complexity, rather than start very complex and try to reduce, because I feel like then your vision is probably not as clear, and when you start complex, I think you're probably trying to do too many things too, which then again fuzzies the clarity of the vision.
I think it's funny you say that, because talking about the way that we work, I tend to be the one who...
maybe that's what I aim for, but I don't get there. I don't know.
I tend to be the one who does the simple, big thinking stuff. and you tend to be the one who like layers in.
Yeah, but I like when the stuff comes to me very simple.
Okay.
So then I could layer in
Sure.
the complexity and the details and all of that. But when the charcoal sketch comes to my desk and there is like 15 zillion lines, I'm like, oh shit, it's already too complex.
Yeah. No, that's true.
But it goes back to, your reading and your understanding of that sketch, right? Like if you pass that concept along to someone else, how easily is it for them to grasp what that thing wants to be, right? So yeah.
I think that, so for me, one of the things I'm always saying in the design process is, let's start simple. I mean, even when we're in it already, like, let's go back and let's like be simple, and then let's layer on complexity, because that tends to be, I found historically for myself, and I think for most students and architects, the most efficient way to do it. So sometimes I think when there's a time and a schedule factor that's impending on weighing on you, there's this idea of like, if I can just be more complex and layer in all the stuff at the very beginning, I'm going to kind of make progress quicker. But all it does is just create confusion. It's like, so in student work, young student work, the first thing they show, and again, it has the fountains, the window mullions, and the doorknobs and all this stuff. I'm like, let's like, again, 10 pieces of cardboard. Say something with that, and then we can layer in the stuff. But I think you also need both. So, the thing for me that I always struggled with was complexity, because, and this is now I'm just talking about when I was a student. I would be in diagramming stuff and drawing big gestures, and I would always be on the hunt to find like the perfect one, and I couldn't let it go before getting to the next step of, again, adding complexity. The reality is, if you're a one-person show, you can't do that, because you never make that. You will never get to the end. One step at a time, it doesn't work. So I think
I had the opposite issue in school. I just wanted to dive and dive and dive, and I had a more of the opposite problem, where I needed to simplify, like kind of like go back a few steps.
Okay, so this makes a lot of sense.
So
I was the opposite.
That explains why we work well together.
So
and what we do in the office.
So in your presentations, like, you would show like a whole bunch of stuff.
Oh yeah, I would like already have thought about like what materials would go there and like what would be this and that, and but like the overall idea and like bigger diagram, like I was really wrestling and making it clear and like boil it down to like 3 words, because I had all of those things.
That's so funny. I was the complete polar opposite. I would show up and show like a cone, this like cone shape, like, this is the project, and everyone would be like, what the fuck? But I had all of this. I would have, and it wasn't bullshit. I had a lot of reasons for it and a lot of thinking. I just could never develop it, because every time I would add, like I was saying before, every time I would add something, I'd be like, this is taking away from the purity of the form or the purity of the idea or whatever. So I would just like constantly pin up, and I would become, like, I guess the word would be obsessed at some point with, the cone shape or the 3 bars or the floating grid thing, and I'd be like, but this is it. I've done all my architecture research. I know that this is the solution. I should have been thinking this is the path, but this is like the solution. And fuck everyone else, because your premise is you have all this stuff going on, but it's on false premise, right? It's cool you have, and my other colleagues in my classes, like, it's cool you have all this stuff going on. We can talk about the tectonics and whatever, but fundamentally your idea makes no sense. So why are we even bothering talking about this project? And I couldn't get over that, which was not a good thing, but I was also, I feel, correct. It drove me nuts that like students who would have the shittiest ideas, the shittiest party and like floor plans or whatever, would go forward and develop all this stuff. I'm like, well, this is a waste of time. Like, this is stupid. Like, why bother? Your cake has a core of shit. Why do we care about like the frosting? And it drove me crazy in school. Of course,
no, I had like I mean, mostly my thesis project, I remember like getting into like reading, complex ideas and like doing like complex research and then doing like all of this stuff. But then it was just like so much. I was like, I have to simplify. I have to go back. I have to like understand why, and it's just, again, I think the excitement of like, you know, getting deep into something.
Yeah.
And it's so funny.
You know, we're
funny.
complete opposites, because I always had a very more like, I mean, in-depth research, but high-level view of what just made sense. And I still operate, I mean, now I have more skill sets, but I still operate that way. So when I see projects in their design process, you know, we have meetings internally or with clients or whatever, and someone suggests something that's not fundamentally right, it won't happen. I will shoot it down. It'll be shot down. We'll talk about it, but it's mostly we're talking about it just because we're supposed to talk about it, and then I'm going to shoot it down because I feel I have that level of conviction for the core of projects. And yeah, that gets into the stubbornness. I know I sound like really stubborn, but like it's not going to happen.
Well, but I'm the one who does the plans. So.
You're going to sneak stuff in there? What is that thing you put in there? Don't worry about it.
You know.
But you really do need those two things. And, you know, or if you're a person on one end of the spectrum to be working with on the other, because it just helps. And so the only way, not the only, but a great way to make progress if you struggle, because you're, again, type A or B, is to just see the other version of it. And that's, like I said, passing off the diagram is a wonderful thing for me, because I'm like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty interesting. And of course it not is just an expression of my idea, but there's a misinterpretation in the positive sense of, oh yeah, that's actually, I never thought about that, or that produces something else. And then, as you would say, it's the potato that gets passed back and forth. And that's the fun part. But yeah, yeah. It's just, yeah.
Now, I was going to touch on the subject of clients in this editing process.
Yeah.
How can a client be useful in helping editing a project?
You know, clients are a weird one in the case of...
First of all, are they even aware that whatever they say is going to edit the project?
They don't think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So clients are the anomaly of all the different parameters, factors, and bits of information and types of information. Clients are their own amorphic, weird... They're like the wild card. They're like the Joker.
Yeah, they are.
Know?
Yeah. Unpredictable.
They're unpredictable, but also they have all of the power. Because obviously it's their project, it's their money, it's their schedule, it's their property. And so it's weird because they might come into a meeting and have feedback that has no foundation to it whatsoever. At the end of the day, does it matter? No, it doesn't. It doesn't matter. You know, if like, oh, we're having schedule problems. Okay, well, that makes sense. Budget problems, that makes sense. Program is missing, I don't know, whatever else, that makes sense. Aesthetics, that makes sense. Constructability, that makes sense. I don't like it. Okay, why? Understanding why is helpful for us to move forward, but does it validate their opinion? Absolutely not. Understanding a client's motives is only important to move forward. Again, I'm going to repeat it. It does not validate their opinion. And the thing that clients should understand is that because you don't like something, it does not mean you're right. In the broader sense of things, there are some aspects of houses or buildings that are subjective, like they have personal preferences. That is, I'm kind of separating that. That's fine. That's like one thing. But so I don't think clients think about themselves as contributing to the editing process or being a motive for it. They just say, I want this thing that's not in there, figure it out or stick it in there. That's also the difference between clients I've found who have exposure or knowledge of the arts versus clients who don't. And I'm not talking about wealth, intelligence in their own field, IQ level, the ability to think rationally. All that stuff doesn't make a difference whatsoever when it comes to how clients think during a project. what matters the most I've seen so far, and then in terms of like, predictability, is if they have knowledge and appreciation of the arts. If they do, their thinking tends to make a lot more sense because they are able to understand the project that way and more from a distance and say like, I don't quite, what would be an example? Like it's not quite what I would have thought, but like I totally understand why it makes sense in what we're doing here. And I trust you guys and it does look pretty good. Let's go for it. Versus clients who don't have any of that, knowledge of the arts, they tend to come and say like, I don't like it. And it's like, okay,
I think there's
that's
also
a weird thing to say.
Communication flaw,
True.
But
This is true. But what I'm saying though is that clients who are very successful in their own businesses and have all the intelligence and the rationale and the decorum, the way of socially speaking in a correct manner, that doesn't carry over into projects a lot of times. The only time I've seen it consistently carry over is, again, if they understand, they collect photography, they collect art, they're musicians, that for some reason, either they're the ones producing it or just observing. For some reason, that bleeds over into how they behave with architects and designers. The rest of the stuff doesn't matter. It's weird.
Yeah.
And I've talked about this with a lot of architects too. They're like, oh yeah, so and so's a high level person, founded their own business, successful, has this and that, nice person. But when it comes to meetings, nothing they say makes sense.
Yeah.
And like repeatedly, I hear this, and I've seen it too firsthand. So I don't know.
I think there is like kind of like the role of clients in that editing process, and there is those who basically don't really provide anything useful to help edit the project. Because saying like, I don't like it, it's not, what do I do with that? Like, to go tell Michelangelo, I don't like it. Okay, so I'm gonna look at you and be like, am I supposed to read your mind and figure out like why you don't like it? Like, well, that's again, how can I edit it to make you like it? I need more information than that. That's
the responsibility of the architect to ask questions and to engage.
Yeah.
Which a lot of architects, that's not our primary motivation for doing this, is to have to play negotiator or to be that proactive. Like, first of all, like anybody should be more able and willing and proactive in trying to create discourse.
Yeah.
First of all, does it happen? No. So that's the reality. And so as an architect, you have to deal with that. You have to ask questions, you have to engage even when it's like, it doesn't seem like you should be, because they don't seem to be contributing despite it being their project. You have to do it, and that's just part of the reality. But so like, it's weird. The way I think about clients in this conversation is less to do with the word editing and more about an architect having to not let their ego be involved and become kind of detached and say, okay, it's just going to evolve and it's just going to change. I don't think it's an edit as much as it is a change. You know what I mean? An edit kind of implies like we have a direction, but oftentimes if a client comes in with information and it changes, it's new information, it's a shift, it's a change. Yeah. That needs to be adopted into it some way. And
then I think there is clients who are too involved in the editing process.
Yeah.
The ones who actually want to know, like, how is it that we're editing? Like, what are we doing exactly? Or they brainstorm and start proposing idea on like how to edit. And
it's slippery.
I think that's I don't know which one's the hardest to deal with, to be honest.
That one is, well, there's a lot of subtleties and specifics to the individual of the client, because if someone is like hyper invested and interested, but they carry themselves a certain way, it can be fine. If they don't, and they're immature about it or unprofessional about it or disrespectful, that's not fine.
Yeah. So
that's the worst probably combination. But it's a slippery slope, because like, like I said before, architects have to be able to explain their ideas to anybody. But there's always times in a project where we don't have the words to explain it because it's based on intuition, which is based on real many years of experience. Or I'm struggling with the words because there's too many ideas. This is like a weird thing, but I saw a clip of Eminem and it was talking about Trump. This is what popped in my mind. And he was saying that he struggles, Eminem is known as like one of the greatest rappers of all time. And his flow, his lyrics, whatever you call them, I don't know, is like unparalleled. No one can match him. And all the other rappers are like, this guy is on another level. The bars he spits are mental. The words he uses, he just stitches stuff together. And yet, he was talking about Trump, who he is not a fan of. He does not like him. He was saying, I struggle to talk about him because I have so many thoughts that come into mind that I don't know what to say. And it's the same thing that happens sometimes when clients or anybody is asking like, well, why this? Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that instead? And I'm like, there's like 100 micro reasons, and I don't know how to convey them in a way that's going to be productive for the conversation. I can convey them, but like, I don't know how to do it in a way so that we'll move forward in a smooth way without it being like half an hour of me talking. And that's something that I try to work on. But it's also like sometimes for clients, is how about you not ask, or how about you can ask but don't suggest stuff. Like how you just got to trust who you're working with, because everything we do, it's the design, it's all the stuff: design, sustainability, Title 24, costs, schedule, client preferences, our preferences, of course. Constructed, but all of it's thought about with every single thing, and sometimes it's really hard to unpack like how did all of those layers fold in together for this thing to be the way that it is. At the same time, I think it is a common struggle for architects to be more to let go of certain things.
And I think that's a common struggle probably in our generation too, where people want to know everything. I mean, I don't know that Frank Lloyd Wright was asked, like, why is everything coming this way? And like, what, like...
He probably was, and his response was, because that's what I say, so fuck off.
If you had to edit something from your our last project, what would it be?
Well, there's one right now, and we're in the middle of it, so it was not like a completed thing. It's materials. I've decided that the next thing we're going to do, no materials, all white. That's it.
A white building?
White building and glazing. That's it. It won't be that in the end.
Oh.
But in this process, I've decided to kick out materials.
Yeah. Gone.
Not part of the conversation. For the design and for the overall process with all the people involved, that's going to be the best thing, and it's necessary. And I think that's also where, as you mature as an architect, you understand your process, but you also begin to really think about, how can I manipulate my process to help the whole thing, the whole project move forward as I'm working with the client, the contractor, the engineer, mechanical, the expediter, all these people. How can my process be adapted and changed?
That's a good point, actually. The edit is not just to the project and the design itself. It could also be to the project process, the way of working. That
is true, and that's for the next recording. I think there's more to say, but maybe this is a pretty rich topic, so we can dive more into this, and then the idea of process at the next one. Give us an outro.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. If you like what we do, please follow us on all the platforms. We're on Spotify, YouTube, social media, Instagram, Facebook. You can shoot us an email at, hello at secondstudio.com.
No, secondstudiopod.com.
Oh, God, secondstudiopod.com. You also have a hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message, call, it goes to voicemail, and leave us a message if you have any topics you want us to talk about, any guest that you think is so interesting that needs to be on the show. I'm still waiting for jokes. I don't think I got any jokes sent out to me. So that's that. And stay tuned for more.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys listening. A lot of good stuff, good interviews, blah, blah, blah. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.